Good evening. I'm Denise Trouth, President of Texas State University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this online event presented by the Common Experience in the LBJ Distinguished Lecture Series. Tonight we celebrate the anniversary of the Higher Education Act, signed on our San Marcos campus by Texas State's most famous alumnus, President Lyndon B. Johnson. This act was signed 55 years ago yesterday, on November 8th, 1965. That historic moment made federal financial assistance available to thousands of young Americans to enroll in college. The act was also created TRIO programs, including Upward Bound, and brought the university experience within reach of countless students. It remains foundational to Texas State's mission today. We strive to help all students succeed through quality academic programs and holistic support. Each year, Texas State presents an academic theme with events for students, faculty, and staff, and the local community. This is our common experience. Our theme this year is Dynamics, exploring the motivating forces for growth and change. Dynamics is about movement. It's about progress caused by physical or moral forces that drive us towards something new. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Higher Education Act, Texas State commissioned a sculpture which now graces the entrance to the Bruce and Gloria Ingram Hall on our San Marcos campus. Named Texas Twister by artist Alice Aycock, it signifies the energy created by the exchange of ideas and knowledge. Like other programs and installations across the university, Texas Twister honors the legacy of LBJ and his belief in the dynamic power of changing lives. It's a symbol that reminds us we are helping students push boundaries and create the future of their dreams. And there is nothing more dynamic than the pursuit of achieving your dreams. That's why tonight's speaker resonates so well with this year's Common Experience theme. He inspires us. He reminds us of the forces that set in motion the transformation of the American college experience. And I am excited to introduce our LBJ lecture moderator and our featured guest speaker. First, our moderator. DaLyah Jones is a first-generation Texas State alumna, class of 2016, and a staff writer for the Texas Observer. Her work has also been published in Texas Monthly, Austin American Statesman, and NBC News. DaLyah was previously a producer for All Things Considered and a reporter for Austin's NPR station, KUT 90.5. While attending Texas State, she worked at KTSW, our student-run radio station. And now let's meet our LBJ Distinguished Lecture speaker. John Quiñones is an Emmy-winning ABC News veteran and the creator and host of the social experiment show, What Would You Do? He has an incredibly moving story. A lifetime of never taking no for an answer took him from migrant farm work and poverty to a stellar career in broadcast news and television. He spent more than 30 years at ABC News at the anchor desk of 2020 and Prime Time. He's a 7-time Emmy Award winner with numerous other honors to his credit. What Would You Do? His hidden camera ethical dilemma show is now in its 14th season. Through all the memorable episodes, John has become the face of doing the right thing to millions of fans. He earned his bachelor's degree in speech communication from St. Mary's University in San Antonio and a master's degree from the Columbia University School of Journalism. He was also awarded honorary doctorate degrees from Davis and Elkins College in West Virginia and from Utah Valley University. As a prelude to all his success, he was a participant in Upward Bound, the program President Johnson set in motion 55 years ago. John Quiñones was a Bobcat too. He enrolled in some of his first classes at Texas State, so his initial steps on the higher education path were here at the same place where LBJ walked once as a student. Today, Texas State celebrates the first day of both Diversity Week and First Generation Week. It's the perfect time to reflect on the anniversary of LBJ signing the Higher Education Act and the life-changing opportunities that higher education provides. Please welcome our moderator, DaLyah Jones, and our very special guest, ABC News veteran, John Quiñones.
Thank you so much, President Trump. And thank you for being here today, John. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Hi, DaLyah. How are you? And thank you very much, Doctor. What a pleasure it is to be with you all.
Yeah, well, before we begin, I do want to do some housekeeping before we jump into our conversation. And by reminding the audience that tonight's event is made possible by the LBJ Distinguished Lecture Series endowment. It's established to honor the legacy of Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States and the Texas State alumnus, by fulfilling his promise to bring important leaders to the university to share their philosophies and experiences. Since 1982, the LBJ Distinguished Lecture Series has presented events at no cost to students, faculty, staff, and the community. So now that we have that wrapped up, I guess we can just kind of jump into this. I really want to know, or I want you to let the audience know a little bit about your background. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because one thing I always love to do is talk to Native Texans about actually being and the legacy that we carry on. So yeah, tell me a little bit about your time.
Born and raised in San Antonio on the west side in the barrio. My dad was a janitor. My mom used to clean houses in Alamo Heights, the rich part of San Antonio. My family, the Quiñones family, has been here at least 5 generations. So, I get a kick out of people when they ask me, John, you're Mexican American. When did you cross the border and come to? It's like we were always here. I tell folks I didn't cross the border crossed me, right? But it was a tough upbringing, loved by my family, very tight Latino family, but we didn't have much. My dad made $50 a week as a janitor, and I used to shine shoes on Guadalupe Street in San Antonio for 10 cents a pair to help, contribute something to the family. And then when I was 13, my dad was laid off from work as a janitor. He wound up being a janitor at my high school, Brackenridge High School in San Antonio. And when he was laid off, we wound up doing what a lot of Latino families in South Texas have to do. We became migrant farm workers. So my 2 sisters, Irma and Rosa Maria, and my mother and father, we jumped on the back of these trucks and we journeyed 1,700 miles with strangers. We didn't know who these people were. And we journeyed all the way to Northport, Michigan, the cherry capital of the world, where we picked cherries for 75 cents a bucket. And I'll never forget strapping this, bucket around my neck, teetering on the top of these ladders overlooking orchards of cherry trees. And it would take me 2 hours, DaLyah, to fill that bucket for 75 cents. And we did that for about 6 or 7 weeks. And then, like all migrant farm workers, we followed the crops, right? We went down to Ohio, to Toledo, Ohio, a tiny little town called Swanton, Ohio, where we picked tomatoes for 35 cents a bushel. And man, I was a champion tomato picker. With these hands, I did 100 bushels a day. And back then, that's $35 a day, right? And then my dad would do 120 bushels, and my sisters would contribute, and my mother would contribute. And we learned the value, as many families, immigrant families, learn, the value of the family coming together in times of difficulty and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? But I'll never forget being on my knees on the cold, hard ground at 6 in the morning with my father, Bruno, looking at a row of tomato plants. For a young 13-year-old boy's eyes seemed to go on for miles and miles. That's what I had to look forward to that day. And my father, Bruno, looking down and saying, Juanito, do you want to do this kind of work for the rest of your life? Or do you want to get a college education someday? It was a no-brainer. I knew I didn't want to do that kind of backbreaking work, right, for the rest of my life, but no one believed in me. I would be the first one in my family to go to college. And when I would get back, I went back to Rhodes Junior High in San Antonio. I would ask my teachers and my counselors, how do I prepare for the SATs? How do I prepare for the ACTs? How do I take advanced placement classes in math, biology, English? Do you know what my own teachers would tell me? My own teachers would look at me and they would say, John, it's wonderful that you have this dream of someday being a reporter on television, because I always wanted to be a broadcast journalist. They would say, John, it's wonderful that you have this dream, but we think you should try wood shop or metal shop or auto mechanics, right? Not that there's anything wrong with those great trades. A lot of people make a good, hard living doing that kind of work, but I wanted to go to college. And my own teachers and my own counselors would do what people do on that TV show, What Would You Do? Every Friday night. They judged me by the color of my skin and the accent in my voice. But thank God for my mother, Maria, man. She was the one who was inspiring, kept motivating me. She would say, mijo, my son, mijo, don't worry so much about you having to wear the same clothes to school every other day. At least we wash those clothes, right? They're clean. She would say, mijo, don't be embarrassed about having to take bean and tortilla tacos for lunch when all the other kids are taking their fancy bologna and white bread. She would say, don't worry about that. What matters is what's in here, in your brain, and what's in here, in your heart, in your corazon. And that's what kept me going. You know, it was during the civil rights movement. And I remember back in the 70s, and I remembered the words of Martin Luther King, who said, in times of adversity, when times get tough, in times of adversity, you got to have faith. And faith is taking that first step. It doesn't matter if you can't see the entire stairwell, right, or the entire staircase. Just take that first step, because tomorrow there'll be another step, and the next day another baby step. And my first step, thank God, was upward bound.
And speaking of upward bound, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that beautiful story with me. And as like a 7th generation Texan who comes from deep East Texas, I totally understand.
All right.
Yeah, the many ways that people try to pigeonhole you or tell you, you know, what you can and cannot do. And it's always really interesting to me on how like folks who come from the backgrounds that we come from are able to kind of strive beyond all the adversity that we're faced with in the first place. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that with me and with us as well.
Of course, of course. It was really hard. I mean, I didn't speak English. In San Antonio, when you grow up in the barrio, 60% of the population is Hispanic in San Antonio, right? We didn't have to learn English. My parents didn't learn English. My father had to drop out of the 3rd grade to pick cotton in Lockhart and Luling, Texas. My mother dropped out of the 4th grade. So they didn't speak much English at all. So I didn't learn English until I went to the 1st grade. Mrs. Gregory's class at Carvajal Elementary. My sisters and I, we couldn't afford preschool or kindergarten. There was no bilingual education back then. So I'll never forget being in my 1st grade class with Mrs. Gregory standing there. You know, I'm twiddling my thumbs because I don't speak English. I don't know what she's saying. She doesn't speak Spanish. And at 10 in the morning, DaLyah, the school bell rings. It's recess time, right? The kids all go to the playground to play. Where does little Juanito Quiñones go? I walked home. I lived 2 blocks from school. And I remember going into my front door and my dear mother Maria going, Juanito, ¿qué pasó? What happened? And I said, se acabó. It's over, Mom. I like school. 2 hours and you're done. This is going to work out very nicely. She grabbed me by the ear and dragged me back to Mrs. Gregory's class because she knew the value of an education, not having gotten one herself.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And one thing you did bring up was upward bound. And I think that two things actually that's important to bring up is that today is actually the first day of Diversity Week and First Gym Week at Texas State University. The experiences that we do have close ties to. And I do want to ask you, you emphasize how I like being a part of that Upward Bound program was something that kind of changed the trajectory of your college career. You yourself are an alumnus of Texas State in that program. And I sort of want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of first taking your education seriously, especially when you do come from those backgrounds that are disparately impacted.
No one believed in me, you know, and I was supposed to go to this high school that was in my neighborhood called Lanier High School, which was the Mexican school. Everyone went to Lanier or Tech. But I knew that if I wanted to, I used to watch Geraldo Rivera, this reporter on 2020 back then. He was the only one with a Latino last name. He was my idol. He had long hair, mustache. And I thought he was Latino. He is Latino. He's only half Puerto Rican and half Jewish, but he was my hero. Anyway, I wanted to be going to broadcasting. And I knew that if I went to Lanier High School in my neighborhood, I would continue speaking in Spanish to all my friends. And I love the language, but I have to work on my accent. I would say things like, this is my shirt, this is my shoes. In Spanish, there is no SH sound, right? So it's always a hard CH. And I knew that if I was going to go into broadcasting someday, I would have to master the language. And I chose Brackenridge out of my district. And it was the last year they allowed us to do that. I chose Brackenridge because it was 1/3 Black, 1/3 white, and 1/3 Hispanic. And I knew that I would have to be forced to speak English, right? And it was in that, thank God, you know, we all have that one teacher. It was at Brackenridge where my English teacher, Mrs. Gutierrez, told me for the first time, she said, John, I love the way you write stories. I love the way you've written your essays for English class. Have you thought about journalism? I said, of course. I've been watching Geraldo all these years. She said, no, I think you should try to talk to the man who runs the newspaper at the school, Mr. Harris, who ran the Brackenridge Times newspaper. And they hired me as a reporter when I was 14. And within 2 months, I was the chief of editorials. So there I was writing these big investigative stories, like why are the teachers parking students parking spaces? Tonight we go undercover and find out. But that's how important, I mean, that confirmation from Mrs. Gutierrez, my English teacher, who was the first one who said to me, you might be college material. I love the way you write, was the first time anyone said, besides my mother, that I was, you know, worthy.
Yeah. And speaking of being, you know, right, you're first gen and you're also having to get used to this college experience who you can't really reach out to family members to kind of get advice about, right? Like I kind of think about like just the struggle of trying to explain things to my own mom or my own family members, like about why like we have to hit deadlines when we put in applications, all of these different things. You know? And I'm curious to know, you know, how did Upward Bound kind of help that transition from just like, you know, being in high school, you know, and then kind of, you know, pivoting you towards the trajectory that you are with your career now?
Well, imagine, you know how tough it was for you and your mom. Imagine doing it in Spanish. Everything had to be filled out in English. They made it so easy by just reaching out and whenever we had any difficulty, helping us explain to our parents. This was a big move for me to go away to Texas State University for 6 weeks for that summer program, because as you know, Upward Bound sent us to college to live in a dorm after 10th grade and after 11th grade and after the 12th grade. So for a kid who would be the first one in his family to go to college, it was a big deal. And not only for me, because I got to experience Buckner Hall there at Texas State and have a roommate. That was the nicest room I'd ever been in my life. It was important for me, but it also was important, to your point, to my mother, who, you know, I remember, you know, Latino families are so tight that they didn't want us going away to college. They, you know, it was bad enough for me. Can you imagine how tough it was for my two sisters, who my parents thought would go away and would get involved in, you know, drugs, and God forbid, they live away from home. And it was really sad and an injustice that they weren't allowed to do what I got to do. And I had to push hard. I remember when I said goodbye to my mother, the first time to go to Texas State to live for just 6 weeks. how far is Texas State from San Antonio? 45 minutes, right? Yes. I was in my driveway, DaLyah, saying goodbye to my mother for 6 weeks, and she was in tears. She's like, Mijo, when am I going to see you again? I said, Mom, it's 45 minutes away. And she's like, Mijo, okay, don't leave me, and I'm going to miss you. And I said, Mom, I want to be back Saturday with some dirty laundry, and I'm going to want some of those bean and tortilla tacos, right? But it taught them too. It not only taught the student, but the parents that it was okay for us to go live on a college campus. And they made it easier for us also to fill out applications. You know, if we couldn't explain it to our parents, they had a bilingual counselor who called my mother and helped them fill out the applications. It was the most beautiful program in the world. To this day, I go to Washington and I testify on behalf of TRIO and Upward Bound. Every year, the government threatens to cut the program down, as you know, because of funding. Funding is always a struggle. But my message is pretty simple, that I wouldn't be the man I am today. I wouldn't be the reporter that I am on ABC News. I wouldn't have this show called What Would You Do had it not been for Upward Bound.
Yeah. And
no
what,
doubt.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No doubt. I said there's no doubt.
No doubt. Yeah. And you know, I kind of think about even in my, my own experience, or even like friends who kind of come from the same background, of how essential like programs like Upward Bound were, but also just like counselors in general, right? Having that face-to-face contact and having people tell you that things are going to be okay, right? Like, or just like, just because you don't know how to navigate this particular space doesn't mean that you're out here alone. And I think that just like not feeling isolated is such a big essential part of this, right?
Yeah, you know what also helped, DaLyah? It was my buddy, Louis Rodriguez. He was one of my best friends in the 10th grade at Brackenridge. And he was the one who said, John, hey, listen, man, they're interviewing kids for this new program called Upward Bound. We should go. And this was a kid who arrived from Mexico like the year before. His English was worse than mine or my father's, but he was struggling and he had tremendous ambition. This kid was my idol. And thank God I teamed up with him, because he was the one who kind of brought me along. He would say, we got to go to this interview. Of course we can do it. Of course you're going to be a famous TV reporter someday, John. I'm going to be a lawyer, And Louis made his dreams come true, but we fed off each other. We were roommates there at Buckner Hall at Texas State. That helped tremendously too, the fact that they teamed us up like that.
Yeah. And I think about just like friendships cultivated in college too, right? And like just those lifelong relationships that are so essential, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And like one thing I did want to transition to, and I hope you don't mind if I bring this up, but you have kids, right, who are kind of following in your footsteps. Yeah. There's Julian, who's a producer at CNN, and then you have Nico, who's a producer and a filmmaker, and then you have Andrea, who's working at Viacom Studio in Miami, correct?
How did you know all that?
Yeah, no, she. You know what I do, John.
Andrea is in New York, working at MTV, and she's doing that show, Teen Moms, and 16 and Pregnant. She's one of their associate producers. She's young. She went to Fordham University. Yeah. Julian is kicking butt. He just covered the election for 2 weeks. He was in Arizona and in Wisconsin. Yeah. He also did something, a big environmental documentary that called The Wonder List that CNN produced a couple of years ago. And Nico's just, doing all kinds of wonderful documentaries also out of Miami. But Andrea and Julian live in New York. And it's funny, right? I mean, I guess there's no coincidence. You think they're not watching and they're not looking at their dad, but they really are. My own problem is they don't want to be on the air. They want to be behind the camera. They don't like this stuff,
Yeah, but even then though, I kind of think about, especially what this moment means to be a storyteller, to be a journalist, to be a reporter, right? And especially during such a controversial time in history. And I'm curious to know, do they, first of all, you're building a legacy. I do want to just like point that out, right? For your own family. So I do want to know your thoughts on like, what it's like to build that legacy, but also like, what are you helping your children navigate through within the journalism realm right now during a time that we've never really seen in history before?
I call journalism the candle in the darkness. Imagine this room, in the room you're in, it's pitch dark, right? There's been a storm and there's no electricity and we're stumbling around and we can't even see our hands in front of our faces. The journalist, he or she is the person with the little candle or the little flashlight in the dark, and they can shine it on the darkest corners of the room to illuminate injustice, to illuminate corruption and civil rights violations and human rights violations. I think when journalism is done right, and we're not always doing it right these days, and we're under attack and nobody believes us anymore and they call us fake news. But when it's done right, those are the kinds of stories that we should be telling. Those are the kinds of stories that I'm proudest of, going into places where no one else has gone, shining a light on the darkness, giving a voice to people who don't have a voice, not only speaking to the movers and shakers of the world, but to the moved and the shaken, right? And that's what I hope my kids carry through with them. And I think they're already getting there. They care about those stories about the environment. Julian has traveled to the most exotic, far-off corners of the world already. Nico was involved in some politics. He did a lot of the Spanish campaign ads for Biden out of Miami. Some really heart-wrenching messages that he was able to shine a light on. He's doing a documentary on the impact of social media on young people and how it's messing with our brains. Andrea is kind of taking the more fun entertainment route right now. She cares about the right things, but it's teen moms. And you know what? Teen Moms is an important series because it's a reality series that shows you how tough it is for a young 16-year-old girl to have a baby and to raise that baby, and what it's like for the boyfriend and the father of the child. How do you overcome all those hurdles? So yeah, it makes me very proud. I don't know about a legacy yet, but I'm really proud of those kids. And I just saw them in Florida 2 weeks ago. We hadn't seen each other in 9 months because of COVID, but we rented a big house and we're able to all get together. And I'm a grandfather now. Julian had a baby.
How old is your baby? How old is your grandbaby? 10 months.
Oh man, that was a trip and beautiful. So yeah, it's not only is it's incredibly rewarding to have kids and to see them go off in following sort of the footsteps of your career, but also caring about important issues and not just making money, or getting a career that gives them a lot of fame and fortune, but rather doing stories that can change the world. And right now, I think we need it more than ever.
Yeah. And one thing, I do want to point out is that Texas State's 2020-2021 Common Experience theme is dynamics, right? And it's all about the forces that motivate us. And what I'm curious about, you talk about like, you didn't even know that. I don't think you knew that your kids were going to follow your legacy, but
No.
but you kind of talk about that, and I'm curious to know what kind of motivates you right now. Is it your kids? Is it like putting that good journalism in the world? Is it kind of being that voice for people who do not see themselves within spaces that that traditionally you would not see them in? What are those motivating forces?
I think what motivates me more is just knowing that the world has changed. Finally, that diversity and inclusion has really seriously become part of all kinds of corporations in this country. It had to take, the George Floyd killing, and all the others, everything that's happened in the last year, the protests in the streets, and unfortunately the violence, that kind of shook America again, much like it shook us back in the 60s. And finally, people are saying, we haven't done things right. And even at ABC, and ABC's been very forward thinking with inclusion and diversity, hiring a lot of faces on the air that are Black and Hispanic and Asian and gay and transgender and people behind the scenes. I think they're making serious efforts. But now more than ever, they're allowing us, the reporters, to do things that we weren't doing before. They're more open to ideas that affect a community that might have been marginalized in the past. So that excites me, because a story that maybe 6 months ago I wouldn't have been able to sell to the network, now they're more open-minded, and now we're hiring people in the decision-making positions, ranks of Disney and ABC News, because it's not just having John Quiñones, this Latino, on the air, but it's having someone in New York who actually assigns John Quiñones to go do that story, a person of color, and because they're the ones who are making the decisions. I can't come up with all the ideas by myself, and neither can Cecilia Vega, our White House correspondent, or Alex Perez down in Chicago, or Jim Avila in LA, or Gio Benitez, Tom Llamas. We have quite a slate now of Hispanic and African-American reporters. So there's more opportunity. My point is there's more opportunities to do stories, and that's what excites me. Doing the story that I did at Fort Hood, Vanessa Guillen, the Hispanic soldier who was so viciously murdered, a story that a lot of people didn't seem to care about, up until 3 months ago. And when we pitched it, we did a 2-hour documentary on what's happening to soldiers at Fort Hood, a lot of them soldiers of color. Last week, you asked me what excites me. Last week, we did the week before, a big hour special on ABC about the power of the Latino vote. Mm-hmm. And I went down to Zapata, Texas.
And sorry to jump in, but I think that right now, this moment right now, like this political moment, is just, it kind of screams why diversity in the newsroom, behind the cameras, in front of the cameras is so essential.
Yeah, DaLyah, we're not there yet. I mean, we still have to keep pushing, but there are hopeful signs. And so I'm taking advantage of this moment to pitch ideas and pitch stories that will get on the air that maybe would not have gotten on the air before, because there's more of an appetite. And I think management now knows and realizes that the face of America is changing, whether some people accept it or not. They're looking more like you, and they're looking more like me. And that's okay. It's okay. But we have to change with it.
Sounds great to me.
Yeah.
Before we jump into our Q&A portion, because we have a lot of questions that got submitted for you. I always like to kind of use a buffer to always ask just anybody I interview, where are you finding joy right now? Like, what's giving you joy? I feel like we're in a world where we're grieving a lot, right? And there's just a lot of transitions happening, and we're not able to gather. You talked about the importance of family. We're not even able to gather with our family and friends in these moments.
No.
So I'm curious to know, like, what's exciting you? What's giving you joy? What are like everyday things that you're doing to stay up?
The big thing that I'm doing now more than ever is riding a bicycle. I got this really cool bike because you can do that by yourself, right? And I just got off it a little while ago. I jumped in the shower and came to see you. But it allows me to drive. I'm now living outside of Dallas, between Dallas and Fort Worth. And out here, even though it's not the country, there are some beautiful ranches with horses and cattle, and I can ride forever. And I'll go 12, 15 miles every day. And just breathing in the fresh air and unfortunately you're alone, but that's what we have to do these days, right? Listening to music, I love listening to music, and I love also talking with my kids about ideas for what they might be doing and what we might be able to do together someday. One of the things that we want to do is some folks in Hollywood have asked me to come up with some pitches for a TV series that would be based on a Latino reporter who covered Central America back in the 80s, based on my life and all the adventures that we had down there. You know, given what's going on, the story, the kinds of stuff that goes on Netflix now, it would be a series based on truth, right? But then loosely based on my character and the adventures that we had in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Panama. Because we had some incredible, you know, brushes with fate. We were, and with death. We covered, you know, wars, civil uprisings. You know, my producer was kidnapped in Panama. We did stories on children who live in the sewer systems of Colombia, Bogota, the capital. I did a story on modern day slavery in the Dominican Republic, Haitian children who were kidnapped at the border with the Dominican Republic and then forced to work in sugarcane plantations. Those Emmys that I have up there, that's one of them was for the sugarcane kids. So those stories, that kind of excites me, talking about what we might be able to do in a feature or a multi-part series that would remind people of what was going on just 25, 30 years ago.
And in some cases still going on even now, right?
Yeah, we're not covering it the way we should. We sort of ignore Latin America these days. Mm-hmm. When I started in the 80s with Peter Jennings, that's why I was hired, because I spoke Spanish and I could go to places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras and Brazil and Argentina and Cuba. We went to Cuba many times. It was wonderful back then. We really paid attention to that region. Now we seem to rely too much sometimes on local reporters who shoot some things with their cell phones, right? And that's not enough. But I want to remind people that we need to do more of that, and also what it was like when I was down there.
Yeah, sounds fun. I can't wait.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm doing an anniversary piece on Selena.
Oh,
you know Selena.
I love me some Selena.
Yeah. I'm going to go interview her parents and her widower, the husband, the guitar player who married her, Chris Perez, who lives in San Antonio. And then I'm going to go interview the Quintanilla family, her parents and her sister. It's been 25 years since she was so tragically lost. Yeah. And I was there. I went to cover that story for Primetime Live when it happened. So it's going to be pretty wild now, going back 25 years later.
Yeah. But I do want to use this moment to jump into our Q&A section from some students.
Okay.
So Noah Castrojon from Texas State, went to Texas State from Houston. First question: as a young Latino man going into journalism, I've always admired you and wanted to know what types of adversities did you have to face or overcome as a Latino trying to make a difference in your field? So, like, actually in the newsroom, what are things that you probably have run into that have become an issue with you? I mean, for your reporting.
It was really, really hard. When I got started in radio broadcasting in San Antonio, there were very few Latinos on the air. So there was this radical group of activists in San Antonio, these Mexican guys with brown berets. They're like, they fashioned themselves under after the Black Panthers. And they started protesting at every radio and TV station in San Antonio, demanding that the managers of those stations hire people who look and sound like me, right? And you. They were, the argument was simple, that the airwaves belong to the people, not to Disney or General Electric or Comcast or anyone else. That they belong to, the airwaves belong to the people of this great country. And therefore, the staff that's on the air bringing you the news, whether it's radio or television, should reflect the population that they're serving. Yeah. And this group called themselves the Bilingual Bicultural Coalition on the Mass Media, or the BBC.
Yeah.
And the BBC started, complaining, and that's why I was hired. I mean, when they threatened to challenge the licenses, the broadcast licenses of these stations, the stations freaked out. They're like, oh my God, we can't lose our license. So let's grab anyone we can grab to bolster our, employment roles, right? To show that we have a few Latinos on the air. And it was the perfect timing for me. I was 18 years old. I just got out of Texas State to go to St. Mary's. And I was hired as an intern at a radio station. And I struggled there forever. I mean, my first job, you got to be from Texas, and you are, so you understand this. I loved rock music and R&B music, Tejano music. My first opportunity to be an intern was at a country music station. And I wasn't a big fan. I am now. I love me some George Strait, but I didn't back then. And, but I went anyway. It was an opportunity, right? It's $2 an hour. But more importantly, it was a chance to get my foot in the door at this radio station while a freshman at St. Mary's. And my first job at this radio station, the disc jockeys had horses at the back of the studios that they would use in parades and rodeos.
Yeah.
My first job was to feed the horses in the back corrals of the studio. Yeah. And to clean up the horse poop afterward during the day for $2 an hour. But at night, I would get a chance to go into the control room, the studio, right? But they had these beautiful microphones and reel-to-reel tape recorders. And I would practice. I would record whatever I could get my hands on and read into the tape recorder and then play it back. Because I was working on my accent, right? And the only problem was at that hour of the night, all the professionals were gone. All the DJs, all the announcers who could give me some advice were gone. The only one there at midnight was the janitor, and his name was Pablo Gonzalez. And Pablo's English was worse than my father's. But I would drag him in there and say, Pablo, listen to my recording. What do you think? And Pablo would say, más o menos, more or less, it sounds pretty good. He was my first critic. So it was a struggle. I mean, to answer the question, every station that I went to work at KTSA radio in San Antonio, and everywhere I would go, they would never give me the good shift. I was the overnight guy or the guy that was an intern, ripping wire copy and feeding the horses. It was so bad that when I finally got a job in radio in Houston, Texas, I couldn't get promoted. I wanted to go into television. No one would hire me in television. I can show you 80 letters of rejection from stations in Amarillo, Austin, McAllen. Not even my hometown would hire me in television. And I was about ready to give up. I thought I'd give up and maybe try to go to law school right after I had my degree from St. Mary's. And it's amazing how life can be. I met a woman who had gone to Columbia University in New York, right? The Graduate School of Journalism. She was a print reporter at the Houston Chronicle. And I met her at an audition for a job that we didn't get. But more importantly, I got to tell her my story. And I told her that I might go to law school. And she looked at me and she said, John, why are you going to go to law school? I can see the passion that you have for telling stories, your love of journalism. If you're going to go back to school, don't go to law school. Why don't you go to the Graduate School of Journalism where I went, she said. And if you want to do that, I will write a letter of recommendation. As an alumna, they'll give you, that opportunity. Maybe that'll help. I said, okay. I'd never even heard of this Ivy League school, Columbia, because the only time I'd been out of Texas was to pick tomatoes in Ohio and cherries in Michigan. But I did that. I filled out an application. I wrote a couple of essays based on my life, telling about my life. And I was accepted to Columbia. But it was hard because even at the age of 25, or 26, I couldn't get a job in television. I had to get a master's degree from this Ivy League school to get a job in Chicago, where I started my TV career. So it was hard. There were all these hurdles, but I just never gave up.
Yeah. And I love how you even allude to the BBC. It kind of just speaks about how San Antonio had, at one point, a great, Black liberation and Chicano movement going on that we don't even talk about. But also, even when you're talking about how hard it is, how hard it was to get a job, we are seeing, a hit to our economy right now. And I do want to move on to the next question. And I think that this is perfect for that. Sophie Rose, a Texas State alumna from San Antonio, actually just asked, what words of advice do you give to recent graduates who may actually be having trouble right now finding jobs within their degree field?
Oh man, it's really can be tough, I know, but if it's journalism, is that fire in your belly that you want to pursue and you want to do at all costs, and you would do even if you weren't getting paid for it, that's the kind of career you want, right? Something you would do even if you weren't getting paid for it. Don't despair. I mean, just turn over every single page you can in applying to these stations. I mean, when I was getting started, it was much harder. You had to physically take a resume. You had to physically take a tape, with your work on it and present it to a news director. Now you can send it, via email and digitally. And so in that sense, it's easier, but just canvass the whole darn state like I did, I called every station, and I wasn't deterred by the no's because, because I was just so determined. I loved journalism and telling stories so much that I knew that I could make a difference, and all I needed was a shot at it. And who knows, maybe if I hadn't run into that woman at that audition, I wouldn't have gone to Columbia, and I would have tried law school. But my advice is just to contact anyone in the business, whether it's me, and you can reach out to me. My email is simple, john.quiñones@abc.com. Send me a note. I will tell the people in New York, that we need, this, I'll look over your resume. And if it's something we can use, of course. We have all these shows, Good Morning America, Nightline, World News Tonight, 2020 at ABC. And I know people at other networks. But initially, you should try to start at the local level, right? At a local station in Austin or San Antonio or McAllen, because you get to make mistakes. And much like I did at that radio station in KKYX in San Antonio, you don't want to, just jump to ABC News in New York and you're not fully prepared. But there are opportunities. You just have to not give up and reach out to people like you and me and just, ask for the advice.
Yeah, and I also think about the importance of networks too, right? Like just making sure that you keep those relationships out of college, right? Because I think about all of them in college who have opened the door for me. So I think about a Reynaldo Leanos Jr., who's right now reporting along the border in the Valley, right? And who actually was the one who was sending me different programs that I could apply to, right, to become a journalist and get into the door. So have friends who, once you graduate, you may not see them, again, time, but just remember that you remember each other and that you may actually be the one, or they may actually be the one who can open a door for you. And
capitalize on the fact that you speak Spanish. If you speak Spanish, capitalize on the fact that you're Latino or Black, because you got to use that. The reason I got hired at ABC News was because the network needed someone to go to Nicaragua to cover the wars, somebody who looked like me and spoke the language. Thank God I spoke Spanish. Yeah. ABC had a white correspondent by the name of Bill Stewart. And if you Google Bill Stewart, ABC News, in 1980, he was shot and killed on camera in Nicaragua, trying to cover the war. And in large part because he couldn't communicate with the soldiers that he was talking to at a military checkpoint. They turned their guns on him, accused him of being a communist. He didn't know what they were saying, and they shot and killed him, all captured on camera. And it made the national news in the US. And the networks then said, we should hire people who speak Spanish to go to Latin America. And there I was in Chicago with my little Emmy. I had just swam across the Rio Grande undercover. And I was hired.
Yeah. And I think that we have room for maybe one more question. And let me see which one. Cameron Allen, Texas State student from Houston. What has been the most rewarding part about journalism and working on your show? What would you do?
Being able to make a change, changing people's lives because you're exposing a story that they otherwise wouldn't be able to tell. And you gave them that opportunity. What comes to mind, and there have been many like that, but I did a story in Colombia, in Bogota, Colombia, South America. One night, I was covering the presidential elections there, a story that didn't turn out to be much of a story, the president of Colombia. And the reason we had been sent down there was because one of the candidates for president had been shot and killed by the drug cartels in Colombia. They thought someone else might be, it was that violent. But when I was there, nothing happened like that, thank God. And I was about ready to come back home to New York. And when I was looking at my hotel window and I saw these children playing on the streets, and they were homeless kids, and they were sniffing glue. They would get glue and inhale it and get high. And some of them as young as 6 years old at the end. And then at night, they would open the manhole covers on the streets of Colombia, Bogota, and they would climb down into the sewer systems. And I asked the woman who works for us there, who are those kids? And she goes, oh, they're called gamines. They're like street urchins. They're runaways, castaways, kids nobody wants. And they live in the sewers of Bogota. There's 300 of them who live in the sewer systems. Can you imagine living next to the rivers of waste? 30 million people in Bogota. And I said, wow, is anybody trying to help them? And she said, yeah, the military doesn't want to and the cops don't. They're afraid, but they're afraid to go down there. They want to clean up the streets of Bogota. So they arrest them when they can, but they won't go after them down into the sewer systems of the city. But what they do is they open the manhole covers at night. They pour gasoline in there and they throw a match to try to burn them out. And I couldn't believe it. I said, wow. And she said, that's one way they try to flush him out. There's one man trying to help them. He's trying to build an orphanage. His name is Jaime Jaramillo. And Jaime goes down there with a bucket of chicken and a 6-pack of Cokes and a loaf of bread. And he does what he can to try to feed the kids of the sewers. And I knew that this was a story that we had to tell. And I knew it wasn't a 2-minute story for the evening news, but rather a story for like 60 Minutes, right? Or Dateline or 2020 or this new show at ABC Primetime Live. So I called my producers in New York and I told them, please let me do this story. I wasn't one of their reporters, by the way. I didn't work for 2020 or Primetime, but I was in Colombia and I had a good story idea. And they said, okay, go for it. And we went down there, we documented the lives. I interviewed a 16-year-old girl who had given birth to a baby in the sewer systems of Bogota 2 weeks earlier. And we interviewed kids whose faces were melted from the fires that the police and the military had started to flush them out. And we took the story back to New York, and 2 weeks later, it aired on Primetime Live. And the day after it aired, American viewers sent in $1 million in donations to help Jaime Jaramillo, this man who was trying to rescue these kids out of the sewers. He built the orphanage, and the kids, wound up going to Florida to take tennis lessons and skiing in Utah and Colorado. He was able to build that orphanage. And had it not been for a story that we did on ABC, the world would not have seen it. And that's that gives me the greatest satisfaction, doing a story shining that light that'll bring a world of difference to victims like those kids and the kids who were modern day slaves in the Dominican Republic, Haitian, Black kids. And on What Would You Do? It's reminding the world that despite all the progress we've made in this country with regard to race and religion and accepting people who are different from us, there's still a lot of work to be done. We're not there yet. And we see it every time we put a hidden camera and we witness injustice or bullying or racism or discrimination, and people ignore it, or worse yet, they take part in it, or they applaud the racist actor in the piece, not knowing they're on hidden camera. That's what makes me really proud. The fact that we can remind this country and the world now, thanks to the internet, that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to accepting people who are different from us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, answering all these questions. I think that everything that you said tonight was so vital. And I just want to say that you're laying the groundwork, not only for folks like me, but for a whole legacy of reporters and journalists who are looking up at you and seeing themselves in you as well.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I said thank you. I'm humbled by that.
Yeah, I did not mean it too. And as we close tonight's event out, I do want to pass the mic, the cam, the Zoom to President Trauth, who has some final words for us.
Thank you, DaLyah. John, on behalf of the whole Texas State community, thank you for sharing your beautiful, your gripping story with us. This has been a wonderful hour, and I'm proud to present to you virtually this commemorative medallion. This is LBJ, and we give this to our LBJ Distinguished Lecture. So we will, of course, send this to you. Normally I would give you this in person, but we will be sending it to you. Please accept it and as a token of our appreciation for this wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored and so humbled by that. It'll take a very special place here in my office because I am a big fan of LBJ and John Kennedy. Had it not been for them, I wouldn't be here today. So thank you so much.
You are most welcome. And this concludes tonight's event. So thank you all for joining us.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.